The legend and the mystery. What if the greatest conqueror in history was also one of its most mysterious figures? Alexander the Great's name echoes through the centuries, but behind the legends lies a story filled with ambition, betrayal, and unanswered questions. How did a young man from a small, overlooked kingdom rise to shatter the world's most powerful empire? And why, after a decade of unstoppable victories, did he die so suddenly, at just 32, leaving his empire to collapse into chaos? From the moment Alexander first took the throne, rumors swirled around him. Some whispered that he was more than mortal, the son of a god destined to rule the world. Others saw only a ruthless upstart, willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Even today, historians argue over the real Alexander. Was he a visionary leader or a tyrant driven by insatiable ambition? Did he truly believe in uniting East and West, or was it all just a mask for endless conquest? But the mysteries don't end with his life. The circumstances of Alexander's death remain one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles. Was it fever, poison, or something even darker? And what happened to his body, which vanished from the historical record, sparking centuries of speculation and wild theories? Some say his tomb still lies hidden, waiting to be discovered. A final secret from a man who built an empire on the edge of the known world. As we unravel the story of Alexander the Great, prepare to question everything you thought you knew. Because behind every victory, every legend, and every monument, there's a shadow, a trail of secrets, betrayals, and mysteries that refuse to die. And the deeper you look, the more you realize. Alexander's greatest conquest might not have been over armies or empires, but over the truth itself. But before the world would know his name, Alexander had to survive a kingdom torn by violence and a family legacy stained with blood. And that's where our story truly begins. Greece in chaos. The world Alexander inherited, long before Alexander's name would echo across continents, the world he was born into was already teetering on the edge of chaos. Ancient Greece, often romanticized for its philosophers and artists, was in reality a land scarred by endless conflict and bitter rivalries. For decades, the mighty city-states of Athens and Sparta had battled for dominance, dragging their allies into a spiral of war that left the entire region battered and exhausted. The so-called Golden Age of Greece had faded into memory, replaced by suspicion, shifting alliances, and the constant threat of invasion. In the north, the kingdom of Macedonia was dismissed by the sophisticated Greeks as a rough, uncultured backwater. To them, Macedonians were outsiders, barbarians who spoke a strange dialect and lived by their swords. But beneath this veneer of disdain, a new power was quietly rising. King Philip II, Alexander's father, was no ordinary ruler. Through a mix of cunning diplomacy and ruthless warfare, he transformed Macedonia from a fractured land of feuding clans into a military powerhouse. His reforms were revolutionary. He introduced the sarissa, a pike twice as long as anything the Greeks had seen, and drilled his soldiers into a formidable phalanx that could shatter enemy lines like glass. Yet Philip's ambitions went far beyond uniting Macedonia. He set his sights on the ultimate prize, the Persian Empire, a vast realm whose wealth and power had haunted Greek dreams for generations. But before he could launch his grand campaign, Philip faced enemies on every side. Greek city-states, threatened by his growing influence, formed uneasy alliances to resist him. Even within his own court, danger lurked. Macedonia's royal family was infamous for its deadly intrigues, where betrayal was a way of life and trust was a luxury no one could afford. The night before Philip was to set out for Persia, the unthinkable happened. During a lavish celebration, he was struck down by his own bodyguard, murdered in front of the entire court. Theories about the assassination have swirled ever since. Some say it was a personal vendetta, others whisper of a deeper conspiracy involving jealous nobles, spurned lovers, or even the young Alexander himself. With Philip's death, the kingdom was thrown into turmoil. Rivals circled like vultures, each hoping to seize the throne for themselves. Into this storm stepped Alexander, just 20 years old, but already marked by ambition and a fierce intelligence. The world he inherited was one of suspicion, violence, and uncertainty. Every move he made was watched, every decision questioned. He faced not only the challenge of uniting a fractured kingdom, but also the burden of living up to a father whose shadow loomed large over all of Greece. Yet in the chaos and bloodshed of his early reign, Alexander would prove that he was not just his father's son, but a force of nature in his own right. But Alexander's rise to power would not be peaceful. To secure his throne, he would have to act with a ruthlessness that shocked even his own people, and the first to feel the weight of his ambition would be those closest to him. Ruthless beginnings, Alexander's bloody path to power. The moment Alexander seized the throne, the world around him seemed to hold its breath. Macedonia was a kingdom where loyalty was measured in blood, and betrayal was never far from the surface. Alexander knew that hesitation meant death. Rivals, both inside and outside his own family, watched for any sign of weakness. Some whispered that he was too young, too untested to rule. Others plotted in the shadows, hoping to snatch the crown before he could even warm the throne. But Alexander moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned his enemies. He ordered the execution of potential rivals, some of them his own kin, sending a clear message that mercy had no place in his new regime. The court, once a nest of intrigue, was suddenly gripped by fear. Even those who had once been close to Alexander's father found themselves under suspicion. In a single calculated sweep, Alexander wiped out anyone who might challenge his claim, proving that he was not just a boy king, but a ruler who would stop at nothing to secure his power. Yet the threats didn't end at the palace gates. Across Macedonia and the Greek world, news of Philip's death sparked rebellion. In Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece, old enemies rose up, convinced that the young king would falter. But Alexander's response was swift and brutal. He crushed each uprising with overwhelming force, leading his armies personally into battle and showing no mercy to those who defied him. His reputation for fearlessness grew with every victory, but so did the rumors about his ruthlessness. Some said he was driven by a cold, almost inhuman ambition, a hunger for power that bordered on obsession. The most chilling example came at Thebes, a city with a proud history and a fierce spirit of independence. When Thebes dared to rebel, Alexander's response was nothing short of catastrophic. He ordered the city razed to the ground, its people slaughtered or sold into slavery. The destruction of Thebes sent shockwaves through Greece. It was a warning written in fire and blood: defy Alexander and face utter annihilation. Even his allies were left uneasy, wondering if the young king's ambition had crossed the line into tyranny. Behind the scenes, speculation swirled about Alexander's true nature. Was he simply following the brutal logic of Macedonian politics, or was there something darker at work? Some claimed that his mother, Olympias, had filled his head with visions of destiny and divine favor, convincing him that he was chosen for greatness. Others whispered that Alexander's ambition was a mask for deeper insecurities, a desperate need to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, and to silence the doubters who had always seen him as an outsider. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear: Alexander's rise to power was built on a foundation of fear and violence. He had shown the world that he would not hesitate to destroy anyone who stood in his way. But as he tightened his grip on Macedonia and Greece, a new challenge loomed on the horizon, one that would test not just his strength, but his very identity. The Persian Empire, vast and ancient, awaited him across the sea, and Alexander was ready to gamble everything for a chance at immortality. But the road to empire would demand more than just ruthlessness. It would require a daring that bordered on madness, and a willingness to risk everything, even his own life, in pursuit of a dream that most believed was impossible. The Persian Gamble. Against all odds, with Greece subdued and his rivals silenced, Alexander set his sights on a prize that had haunted Greek imagination for generations: the Persian Empire. To most, the idea was pure madness. Persia was a superpower, a sprawling realm of unimaginable wealth and military might, ruled by a king who called himself the King of Kings. No Greek army had ever managed to conquer its heartlands. But Alexander was undeterred. At just 21, he gathered an army of 40,000, an audacious force, but a fraction of what Persia could muster, and led them across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was a move that stunned the world, and one that would change history forever. From the very start, Alexander's campaign was marked by boldness and brutality. At the river Granicus, he faced a Persian army determined to stop him before he could gain a foothold. The Persians, confident in their numbers and their cavalry, lined the riverbank, expecting the Greeks to hesitate. But Alexander refused to wait. Ignoring the advice of his most trusted generals, he ordered an immediate assault, plunging into the river under a hail of arrows and javelins. The fighting was savage and chaotic, with Alexander himself in the thick of the battle, narrowly escaping death when a Persian noble shattered part of his helmet with a sword. Only the intervention of his loyal officer Clitus the Black saved his life. The victory at Granicus was decisive, but what followed was even more shocking. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, surrounded and pleading for mercy, were shown none. Alexander ordered a massacre, sending a chilling message to any who would oppose him. Some historians argue that this act was driven by rage. Others see it as a calculated move to discourage further resistance. Either way, the brutality of Granicus set the tone for the campaign to come. But Alexander's march was not just a story of violence. It was also a journey into legend. At Gordium, he encountered the famous Gordian knot, a tangled mass of rope said to hold the secret of ruling Asia. The prophecy claimed that whoever could untie it would become master of the continent. While others struggled in vain, Alexander simply drew his sword and sliced the knot in half. Was it a clever solution or a sign of impatience? The story spread like wildfire, fueling the myth that Alexander was destined for greatness. Yet for all his victories, Alexander's position was never secure. The Persian Empire was vast, and its resources seemed endless. Persian generals plotted to cut off his supply lines, and rumors swirled of new armies gathering to crush the invaders. Even within his own ranks, there were doubts. Some of his men wondered if they had marched too far, if the dream of conquering Persia was nothing more than a death sentence. But Alexander pressed on, capturing city after city, and turning former enemies into allies. His charisma was undeniable, and his willingness to lead from the front inspired fierce loyalty. Still, the deeper he pushed into Persian territory, the greater the risks became. Every victory brought new challenges, and every step forward meant leaving the safety of home further behind. As Alexander advanced, the world watched in disbelief. Was he a genius or a madman? Could he really topple an empire that had stood for centuries? The answers would come soon enough, as Alexander prepared to face the Persian king himself, a confrontation that would shake the ancient world to its core. But the true test of Alexander's ambition was yet to come. Ahead lay battles that would decide the fate of empires and a rivalry that would become the stuff of legend. Clash of Kings, Alexander versus Darius. The world had never seen a rivalry like this. On one side stood Alexander, the young and relentless king whose victories had already become the talk of every court from Greece to Egypt. On the other, Darius III, ruler of the Persian Empire, a man whose ancestors had commanded armies that stretched from the Mediterranean to the mountains of India. Their destinies collided in a series of battles that would decide the fate of the ancient world, and the stories that emerged from these clashes would echo for centuries. The first true showdown came at Issus, a narrow strip of land hemmed in by mountains and sea. Darius, confident in his overwhelming numbers, believed he could crush the upstart Macedonian once and for all. Some reports claim his army was twice the size of Alexander's, with tens of thousands of soldiers and the legendary immortals at his side. But the terrain betrayed him. The narrow battlefield meant Darius couldn't use his full strength, and Alexander seized the moment. With a sudden, ferocious charge, he broke through the Persian lines, sending shockwaves through the enemy ranks. In the chaos, Darius himself fled the field, abandoning his family and royal treasures to the invaders. The image of the King of Kings escaping in his chariot became a symbol of humiliation, a moment that would haunt Darius for the rest of his life. But the rivalry was far from over. Darius regrouped, gathering another massive army and preparing for a final confrontation. The stage was set at Gaugamela, near modern-day Iraq, a vast open plain chosen by Darius to maximize his advantage in numbers and chariots. He even had the ground cleared and flattened for his war machines, determined to leave nothing to chance. Some ancient sources claim the Persian host numbered over 100,000, with cavalry from every corner of the empire and even war elephants brought in to terrify the Greeks. Alexander, outnumbered and facing the full might of Persia, responded with a masterstroke of tactics. He feinted, drawing Persian forces away from their center, then led a lightning assault straight at Darius himself. The Persian lines buckled under the pressure, and once again Darius chose flight over fight. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was the Persian king a coward, or was there a secret deal to let Alexander win? Some even whispered that Darius's own nobles had lost faith in him, sabotaging the battle from within. The aftermath was brutal. The Persian army collapsed, and the road to Babylon and Persepolis lay open. Darius, now a fugitive, was betrayed by his own men, murdered in the darkness as Alexander closed in. The conqueror ordered Darius buried with royal honors. But the message was clear. The age of Persian kings was over, and a new power had risen from the west. Yet, even in victory, Alexander's legend grew more complicated. Some saw him as a liberator, others as a ruthless invader. The stories of Darius's flight and death became fuel for endless speculation. Was Alexander truly destined to rule the world, or was he simply the last man standing in a game of thrones that had claimed countless lives? As the dust settled on the battlefields of Asia, Alexander's ambitions only grew. But with every step deeper into the Persian heartlands, new dangers and temptations awaited. The world had changed forever, but for Alexander, the greatest challenges and the darkest chapters were still to come. The dark side of conquest, tyranny and paranoia victory on the battlefield, brought Alexander unimaginable power, but it also unleashed something darker within him. As his empire expanded, so did the shadows around his throne. The young king who had once inspired loyalty with his courage now began to rule through fear, suspicion, and a growing sense of isolation. The further he marched from Macedonia, the more he seemed to drift from the values and friendships that had once defined him. The first cracks appeared as Alexander tried to hold together a realm that stretched from Greece to the edge of India. He began to adopt the customs of the conquered Persians, wearing their robes, surrounding himself with their advisors, and even demanding that his own men bow before him in the ritual of proskynesis. To the Macedonians, this was blasphemy. Only the gods deserved such reverence, and many of Alexander's oldest companions saw it as a betrayal of everything they had fought for. Whispers of discontent grew louder, and the king's paranoia deepened. It wasn't just cultural differences that fueled the tension. Alexander's court became a place of deadly intrigue, where accusations of treason could mean instant death. The most shocking example came with the execution of Philotas, one of his most trusted commanders and the son of the legendary general Parmenion. Accused of failing to report a plot against the king, Philotas was tortured and killed. Alexander, fearing that Parmenion might seek revenge, sent assassins to eliminate him as well, without trial or warning. The message was unmistakable. No one, not even the most loyal, was safe from suspicion. The spiral of violence didn't stop there. At a drunken banquet in Samarkand, Alexander's temper exploded in a fatal argument with Clitus the Black, the very man who had saved his life at Granicus. In a fit of rage, Alexander killed Clitus with his own hand. The horror of what he had done haunted him for days, but the damage was irreversible. Friends who had once shared his dreams now feared his wrath, and the king's inner circle grew smaller and more isolated. Rumors of plots and conspiracies became a constant drumbeat. When a group of royal pages was accused of planning to kill Alexander, the response was swift and merciless. The young conspirators were tortured and executed, and even Callisthenes, the official historian, was thrown into prison and left to die, guilty by association. The line between justice and paranoia blurred, and the court became a place where trust was a dangerous luxury. As Alexander's behavior grew more erratic, Some began to question whether the pressures of conquest had finally broken him. Was he haunted by the ghosts of those he had killed? Or was he simply consumed by the same ambition that had driven him from the start? Reports from the time suggest that he saw himself less as a mortal king and more as a living god, untouchable, infallible, and above the laws of men. But the cost of this transformation was steep. The men who had followed Alexander across deserts and mountains now wondered if they recognized their king at all. The bonds of loyalty that had held his army together were fraying, and the seeds of rebellion were quietly taking root as Alexander pushed ever further into the unknown. The greatest threat to his empire was no longer an enemy on the battlefield, but the darkness growing within his own heart. Yet, even as his paranoia deepened, Alexander's ambition remained undimmed. He was determined to push beyond the limits of the known world, no matter the cost. But the next chapter of his journey would test not just his power, but the very loyalty of the men who had made him great. To the edge of the world, mutiny and near death, with the Persian Empire shattered and his enemies scattered, Alexander's ambition only grew more feverish. He was no longer content with the title of king or even emperor. He wanted to reach the very ends of the earth, to conquer lands that existed only in legend. His army, battered but loyal, followed him into the unknown, crossing mountains and rivers that no Greek had ever seen. The journey eastward became a test of endurance, willpower, and the limits of human ambition. The campaign into India was unlike anything Alexander's men had faced before. The land was lush and alien, filled with strange animals, monsoon rains, and cities defended by towering walls. The most formidable challenge came at the Battle of the Hydaspes, where King Porus awaited with a massive army and war elephants, creatures that struck terror into the hearts of even the bravest Macedonian veterans. The battle was brutal and costly, with Alexander himself narrowly escaping death as the elephants rampaged through his lines. Yet, through sheer determination and tactical brilliance, he emerged victorious, earning the respect of Porus and adding the Punjab to his growing empire. But the further Alexander pushed, the more his men began to question his sanity. Rumors spread of even greater armies waiting beyond the next river, of monsters and curses that guarded the edge of the world. Exhausted, wounded, and far from home, the soldiers' loyalty began to crack. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, what the Greeks believed was the outermost boundary of the earth, the army finally mutinied. They refused to march any further, no matter how much Alexander pleaded, threatened, or promised. For the first time, the conqueror was forced to turn back, his dream of reaching the world's end shattered by the limits of human endurance. The journey home was no less perilous. Alexander led his men south along the Indus, fighting fierce battles against local tribes and suffering a near-fatal wound when an arrow pierced his chest during the siege of the Malian city. The king's survival seemed almost miraculous, but the ordeal left his army shaken and demoralized. As they reached the coast, Alexander split his forces, sending part of his army by sea under his admiral Nearchus, while he led the rest through the unforgiving Gedrosian desert. The desert crossing became a nightmare. Scorching heat, lack of water, and endless sand claimed the lives of thousands. Some say Alexander's decision to take this route was a calculated act of punishment for his men's earlier mutiny. Others believe he simply underestimated the dangers. Either way, the suffering was immense, and the survivors emerged from the wasteland forever changed. When Alexander finally returned to Persia, he found his empire in turmoil. Corrupt governors had abused their power, and old allies had turned to treachery in his absence. The king responded with a wave of executions, determined to reassert control. But the bonds of trust between Alexander and his men had been stretched to the breaking point. The mass marriages at Susa, where Macedonian officers were wed to Persian noblewomen, were meant to unite his empire, but instead, they deepened the sense of alienation among his troops. The journey to the edge of the world had cost Alexander dearly. He had gained new lands and unimaginable glory, but he had also lost the unwavering loyalty of the men who had once followed him without question. As he looked to the future, Planning new campaigns and dreaming of even greater conquests, a sense of unease settled over his court. The world was his, but at what price? And as whispers of rebellion and unrest grew louder, Alexander's greatest challenge was yet to come, a battle not against foreign armies, but against fate itself. The end and the enigma, death, legacy, and unsolved mysteries after years of relentless conquest. Alexander returned to Babylon, the heart of his vast empire. But the man who arrived was not the same as the young king who had set out from Macedonia. He was weary, scarred by battle and betrayal, and haunted by the ghosts of friends lost along the way. Yet even as he planned new campaigns, dreaming of Arabia and lands beyond, fate was closing in. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander was struck by a sudden fever. Within days, the conqueror of the world was dead, his body lying still in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. He was just 32 years old. The cause of Alexander's death remains one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. Some ancient sources claim he was poisoned by rivals, fearful of his growing power and unpredictable moods. Others suggest he succumbed to malaria, typhoid, or some unknown illness brought on by years of hardship and wounds that never fully healed. There are even wild theories that he was the victim of a slow-acting poison, or that he suffered from a rare neurological disorder. The truth has never been proven, and the debate continues to this day, fueling endless speculation and conspiracy. But the mysteries didn't end with his death. As news of Alexander's passing spread, chaos erupted across his empire. He had left no clear heir. His only legitimate son, born to Roxana, was still an infant. Almost immediately, his most trusted generals, the so-called Diadochi, began to carve up the empire for themselves. The wars that followed were brutal and merciless. Alexander's wife and son were murdered, and his mother Olympias was hunted down and killed. The empire he had built in a decade unraveled in a matter of years, torn apart by the very men who had once sworn loyalty to him. Even Alexander's final resting place became a source of legend and intrigue. His body, intended for burial in Macedonia, was hijacked and taken to Egypt, where it was entombed in a golden sarcophagus in the city that bore his name, Alexandria. For centuries, his tomb was a place of pilgrimage for emperors and conquerors, but then, mysteriously, it vanished from history. Some say it was destroyed. Others believe it still lies hidden beneath the streets of modern Alexandria, waiting to be discovered. The lost tomb of Alexander remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. Yet, despite the chaos and bloodshed that followed his death, Alexander's legacy endured. The Hellenistic age he ushered in transformed the world, spreading Greek culture, language, and ideas from Egypt to India. New cities rose from the dust, and old traditions blended with new, creating a vibrant tapestry of art, science, and philosophy. The kingdoms founded by his generals would rise and fall, but the mark Alexander left on history was indelible. In the end, Alexander the Great remains an enigma. A man who conquered the world, but could not conquer his own fate. His life was a whirlwind of glory and tragedy, ambition and loss, brilliance and darkness. The questions that surround him, about his death, his tomb, and his true nature, continue to fascinate and confound. Perhaps that is his greatest legacy, not just the empires he built or the battles he won, but the enduring mystery of a man who, even in death, refused to be forgotten.